All right, so going back to this previous slide, so some of the things that you guys should be aware of about Roman character as it differentiates from Greek character, which that is going to be sort of visible in the influence that it has on their architecture, is that unlike the Greeks, the Romans were attracted to power, okay, a strong sense of power. They were really kind of ambitious people, right? Whereas the Greeks focused more on an idealistic sort of perfect world. They invented this notion of philosophy or Western philosophy. Um, the Romans, while they saw that stuff as being valuable, they saw it as being sort of above them in a way, superior to them, so they absorbed it. And they were a lot more sort of pragmatic and ambitious, greedy. You could use the word, okay? So let's go on to the next set of slides. So looking at Roman civilization. So this is a text from the book that we're using as a text, right? The Romans became the most prodigious builders of antiquity. Their particular genius was not revealed in any particular building or site or even type, but in the brilliant way that the Roman architect met the needs of a multifaceted society that endured for over 1,000 years. Let's contrast them to, say, the Egyptians, right? The Egyptian culture was there for what, 3,000 years? And the total amount of evolution in the Egyptian culture was not anywhere near as profound as what the Romans would end up doing. They were not just interested in a building type, they were interested in how architecture and cities, right, developed within a culture, how the two things worked in conjunction, okay? And that is a profound departure from what we saw in most of the ancient cultures, with the exception of perhaps the Greeks, okay? So some of the stuff that Rome innovated were materials and techniques, right? They invented the arch. They invented vaulting. We're going to look at each of these things, and there's a couple of videos that we'll be looking at. They invented a form of concrete and a form of mortared masonry. Okay? So the key to these new building types, as I was talking about in that previous slide, is that the focus of the Romans was for these building types that they were developing, right? Bathhouses, warehouses. They developed all of these different things that were more focused on culture than they were focused on, say, a temple of the dead or a temple to the gods. So we start to see that this building and culture interaction, in order for it to develop further, is going to require a high level of infrastructure. Okay? Think about what we had in the times of the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Greeks, and we look at that in contrast to what the Romans ended up developing, and we see that Rome is much more sort of spread apart. But yet it maintained a density that you didn't see in any of the other cultures. Okay, so one of the things that you guys need to keep in mind about Rome is that their architecture was not just influenced by the notion of power from a warfare perspective, but also a monetary perspective. And so business was a key and central aspect of the Roman Empire. One of the other things that the Romans did early on is they codified standards of construction, right? Which means that they wrote it down and systemized it. That's different than what we see in, preceding cultures. Preceding cultures, like for example the Greeks, they essentially tried to codify a style of building, right? The Greeks were masters of proportion and articulation. The Romans were masters of technique and technology. And as such, they absorbed all of what the Greeks did, part of what the Etruscans did, and expanded it, and then they wrote it down. They made it into a form of sort of rules that could be followed. Okay, so one of the key things that the Romans did was to lay these foundations for this complex society that was developing and building at the time. And some of the key things, or the key sort of breakdown of elements that created this new environment in the development of a culture were the use of hydrology and aqueducts. Okay. The second thing was the first network of roads. And finally, the construction technology is sort of the third component. All right. So if you think about it, one of the key problems of the development of human beings, the development of cities for human beings is water, right? We all live in California here. And in California, we've had something called the drought for a long time, right? We've got, 25 million people living in the 5 counties surrounding Los Angeles. Okay? That is way more people than the water that we have here could support. So we get water from Northern California, and we get water from the rest of the country, right, via the Colorado River and a variety of different aqueducts. Now we're a modern society, running from the 20th to the 21st century. These guys were doing this at the change, the sort of the beginning of what we call our modern calendar, right? So before zero, these guys were already building aqueducts, and they were bringing water into Rome. I was fortunate enough to be able to go and spend a little bit of time in Rome this summer. And one of the things that's trippy is you walk around and they have, we have water fountains where you push a button and water comes out, right? They've got water fountains that date back to Roman times that are just constantly running. The water you just walk up and there it is. It's got fresh water pouring out of it. You watch some lady walk up and sit down, take a drink. You watch some other person walk up and it looks like a fountain, right? Like it's like some sort of a decorative thing, but it's not. It's potable water that's literally running, right, constantly. There's no shut off for it. And so they fill their water bottles up and it goes. But a lot of the water distribution dates back to, when Rome was being developed, right? One of the things that I want you guys to note is this idea of the baths, right? So you got the Diocletian baths up at the top, the baths of Nero, you've got the baths of Caracalla. This is one of those building types that didn't exist before, right? So to picture a bunch of naked Roman men sitting in this like big giant bathtub. All right. There's probably a section for women there somewhere too, but I don't think they mix. But in order to support all of those baths, right, you had to have water. You had to have constantly flowing water, right? You don't want to get in the bathtub with a bunch of, I don't know, rubbed off skin and stuff, right? One of my friends, he refused to ever swim in a swimming pool because he said a swimming pool was nothing more than human soup, which is kind of gross. But anyway, these baths have this continual flow of water, and one of the things that allowed that was all of these aqueducts that were built throughout Rome. If you think about it, these guys were building this stuff, okay, at a time period when the Egyptians were still running around in the sort of North African continent, okay, and they were building these amazing sort of feats of engineering. They would literally have to understand how far something dropped, right, in height over 40 miles. I mean, that's to me is like incredible, right? Because you have to have obviously a lower point somewhere if you want water to run downhill. So if you're picking up water at some mountain source a long distance off and you have to cross a valley or you have to cross a river, that's how you do it right there. You build this massive sort of bridge. This is the Pont du Gard. I believe it's in France. And it literally uses 3 tiers of arching to cross valleys and stuff to get water to various parts of Europe. There's another view of it. Okay. The Romans built aqueducts anywhere they needed to get water to their cities. And so here is an example of a different aqueduct in Segovia, Spain. And you can see how tall this one is. This literally dates back to Roman times. It's still there. All right. The second thing that was on that list of stuff is a road system. Right? Even in the development of our country, when we wanted to kind of establish a greater continuity in the United States, one of the first things we did was to build railroads. Okay? After that, one of the things that we did was to build a road system. We did that, in the last 200 or 300 years. So we did that in what would easily be termed the modern era. The Romans did it, before Christ, before the Common Era. And so you can start to get an idea of the road systems that the Egyptians sort of developed throughout their empire, okay? Up until our time period, this was the most extensive road system that had ever been developed. A lot of them, you can actually go still see portions of it. They're still in existence today. And some of them have become the foundation or the basis for modern day roads. Okay? So the idea behind the road system was to link the empire in such a way that goods and money could flow and that armies could easily get from one point to another. Okay? So typical Roman road system. How are we doing on time there? All right. So typical Roman road construction here, we see an example of it, and you see a section down here of what they did as far as developing and building the road. There was a sublayer of compacted sand and earth, then there was a crushed rock layer. This is very similar to how we build roads nowadays. Okay. There was another layer that had a cement mortar in it. There was a gravel layer that was finer on top of that, and finally there was the finished layer, which was some form of stone that had a harder surface that would keep it from essentially wearing away.
How do we do our roads now?
What's that?
How do we do our roads now? We
do our roads in a similar fashion, but we use asphalt and concrete as the finished layer. And there's usually, I'll talk about that in just a sec. Let me stop this thing so I don't go over on time.